The first thing we need to understand about why the Revolutionary War happens is we have to understand about something called mercantilism. Have you ever heard this term before, mercantilism? Probably. I can't think of any reason why you would have heard it in anything other than a history context. Almost nobody uses mercantilism anymore. But this picture gives you a pretty good idea of what mercantilism means. Sorry, somebody's baking in the kitchen right next to me and he's rattling all the bags. Mercantilism involves a mother country receiving goods from all of their little colony countries. So we talked for a long time about the fact that all these little colony countries were like cash crop colonies. They tobacco and rice and indigo and all of these foods, wheat and all these things. And what would happen is that England, as a mother country, would point to that colony and go, hey, you make really good tobacco. That's all you're going to make is tobacco. And then you're going to make all the tobacco we need to trade with the whole rest of the world in tobacco. And in return, we will sell you the stuff you need to live and buy the tobacco from you. And then we will become rich as a mother country. That's the idea. Can anybody guess why this doesn't work? Anybody want to hazard a guess what's wrong with this whole system? Okay, let's do a little exercise. Usually I would do this in class, so let's do a little exercise. How many of you have ever bought a bag of chips from a gas station? From a gas station specifically? Yeah? Why? Oh my gosh. It's so much more expensive than buying it from the grocery store. Why on earth would you ever buy a bag of chips from the gas station? Under what circumstances would you not pick up that bag of chips and go, wow, that's super expensive. I'm going to go to the grocery store and get chips instead. I'm not, judging you, but why would you? In honesty, think about the times that you did that. Why did you make that decision at the time? Anybody want to say?
Because not a lot of grocery stores are like right off an exit as you're going along and getting some gas. While you're filling up your car, you're like, hey, I'm a little bit hungry. I'll grab some Cheetos or something.
Even though it's more expensive?
It'll be more expensive to most likely drive to the closest grocery store and get the chips.
But if you knew you were going to be driving and were going to want chips, why wouldn't you stock up in advance?
I'd stock in advance.
But you didn't because you bought the chips.
That's because I wasn't thinking I was going to want chips. But then I was like, hey, I'll have some chips while I'm here.
Right. Okay. So this is a problem of locality, right? You're paying slightly more for the thing that's right there rather than going to all the trouble to go to the place where this thing is less expensive, right? Because in the balance, it all kind of works out that it's actually not that much more expensive. It's not that it costs inconvenience to go to the grocery store instead of going to the gas station you're already at, right? Okay, so we have that. Now I want you to think about grocery stores in general. Have any of y'all ever worked in a like the stocking of a grocery store? Have y'all ever done that as a job? Have you ever known anybody who has? Do you know that they throw away a lot of stuff from grocery stores because they go past their best buy date or their sell by date and then they just get bundled up and thrown out? They get redistributed to other places, but a lot of it just gets thrown out. So why do grocery stores buy so much of things that they can't sell? It's a really silly question and it has a really, really simple answer. Why do grocery stores buy so many products that they can't sell? Anyone?
Cheaper for them to buy in bulk.
Do they have any way of predicting how much people are going to buy? I mean, sometimes they run out, sometimes they have extra. They have no way of predicting. This is the problem with mercantilism. If you're the mother country and you have a whole colony, okay, so I'll be England, okay, and Savannah, you be Virginia. Okay, so you grow tobacco. That's a big part of what tobacco grows or what Virginia grows is tobacco. As England, you belong to me, right? You're my colony. I own you. You're Virginia, you belong to me. I'm your mother country. Okay, now Joseph wants to buy tobacco and he wants to sell linen because he's France. Okay, you, Savannah, want to buy linen because you want something to make clothes out of. So the deal is, the way that I set everything up so that all the money would funnel through me, is that you have to sell your tobacco to me and you have to buy your linen from me. In order for you to buy it from me, I have to buy it from France to sell it to you, okay? So it's a big triangle, right? I have to as England, as the mother country, I have to go to France and I have to buy linen. Then I have to turn around and sell it to you. You have to make tobacco and I have to buy all the tobacco you make. And then I have to turn around and sell it to France. Why doesn't France just come directly to you? Why doesn't Joseph over there in France with his linen just go straight to Savannah with her tobacco and say, here, we'll just sell to each other?
Because the
Who-
British are like, yo, you can't do that. That'd be smuggling. You got to sell to Britain itself, and then Britain will sell it to the colonies.
Right. So in order to do that, Joseph, in order to sell directly to the colonies, there are two things that have to happen. You have to circumvent the British, right, which costs you a little bit. And you have to make a decision that you're going to pay for the price of buying the tobacco at a lower price directly from the colonists and getting it fresh. So that's a transportation cost to you. Probably you're going to do the gas station thing. You're going to go to England, pay slightly more for whatever tobacco they have that you want. Not all of it. You're not going to buy all the Cheetos. You're just going to buy what you need. But in order to ensure that they have it when you need it, I have to buy all the tobacco and hold it like a grocery store. Okay. So I lose money because I have to pay soldiers to make sure that y'all aren't trading with each other. I lose money because no matter how much tobacco Savannah makes, I have to buy all of it. And then I have to turn around and buy linen from Joseph in the hopes that it's not too much for the colonists to buy and that I don't end up with extra that I have to throw out. As the middle person in the middle country, as the mother country, I end up bearing all of the cost of this, okay? And y'all still end up with the products you want. Maybe you pay a little more sometimes, maybe you pay a little less, but all of the cost of dealing with all the problems falls right on the mother country, okay? And how do I get that cost back? Who am I going to take it out on?
The colonists?
The colonists, right. I'm not going to pay it myself. I'm the mother country and you belong to me. So I'm going to charge you more for the linen because I need to make up the cost of getting the tobacco from you and then not being able to sell it, or of keeping ships so that you can, you know, so that I can prevent you from smuggling to each other. Since I have those extra costs, I'm going to charge the colonists. That's who I'm going to charge. I'm not going to charge France. I need them to buy and sell from me. If they don't buy and sell from me, they'll buy and sell from somebody else. So you're going to pay for it. Cool. We cool with that? Savannah, we good? Sure. Yeah, no, it doesn't work because of that system. Okay, so let me go back to this. Ah, I lost it. Okay.
Did you play?
No.
Okay.
Okay. So that is the problem with mercantilism. This is what it's supposed to look like. This is nothing like what it looks like. So we just did this. We covered what mercantilism looks like in the British colonies. In order to deal with this, before 1763, there were laws. Like the English had laws, the Navigation Acts. They tried several times to pass new laws as only English ships can sail into English colonies. And in order to get to the English colony, they have to sail through England first. So you can't go directly from France to the colony. You have to go through London first. And they pass laws that say things like sugar can't be bought from a French sugar plantation. It has to be bought from an English sugar plantation. But the truth is mostly what they engage in is something called salutary neglect. And salutary neglect means we have laws, but we don't want to waste the money to enforce them. Kind of like weed laws in Texas right now. Like they exist, but nobody wants to pay the expense of actually enforcing them. So you all just stay out of trouble and just buy things when we need you to, and it'll probably all work out. As long as England doesn't have some, I don't know, great big, suddenly really expensive cost, we'll be okay. Everything will probably work out. A little bit of linen going directly to the colonies, a little bit of tobacco going directly to France, whatever, it'll be okay. Maybe. But there is a great big sudden expense. And that expense is, well, this is the triangle trade, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The triangle trade is that slaves coming from Africa ended up at the sugar plantations. Sugar from the sugar plantations ended up in New England, where they made it into molasses and rum, and then rum was traded back to Africa. We'll come back and talk about that later. We have set up these great big global joint stock companies. And these companies are humongous. The East India Company that trades with India has its own army, has its own military. It has its own, we're talking tens of thousands of troops that just are private mercenary troops that belong to the East India Company. And what they do is they land, and they don't inhabit a town that already exists in India. They build their own. So they land on a coast, they build a trading port of their own, and then they move inland and start taking over the trade from the local area. They have become so expensive that they are actually crumbling under their own weight, and they're going to the British government for help. And the British government is also the people who own this thing. They're nobles in Parliament who are also owners of the East India Company. So all the most influential people in government are also stockholders in the East India Company. And the East India Company is so big that it's going to fail. Like it's crumbling under its own weight. And then war breaks out. Now, in 1754, the French, this is what would have been covered in the documentary that you watched on Friday, but in 1754, the French and the English were arguing over who was going to get the forts in the Ohio River Valley. In 1754, a young Lieutenant Colonel, George Washington, was ordered by the governor of Virginia to march troops to the Ohio River, where he knew the French had set up a fort, and to remind them that these were English holdings. Thank you very much. Young Lieutenant George Washington marched on the fort, which was Fort Duquesne, and basically had his butt handed to him on a platter. He watched the massacre of all of his men and then retreated to another place and built another fort called Fort Necessity. But the Battle of Fort Duquesne was the beginning of this conflict between French and English forces in the Ohio River Valley. The French and English were already fighting with each other in Europe over a war of succession that has something to do with Germany, which I'm not going to make you learn about because it's like not really relevant. They're always fighting over something all through history. This is what they were fighting about at the moment. When the French started to move into the colonies at the same time the English started to move into the Americas, but they did it slightly a different way. So they did it as religious refugees, just like the Puritans. They tried to find a Northwest Passage, just like the Dutch and just like the English. And they tried to start a colony and it didn't work on the Saint Laurent River. And they had a lot of the same experiences, but a lot of their colonies were based around fur trading and not necessarily so much around establishing a colony and creating a new settlement. They were mostly based in shipping, fur trading, things like that. And they were 100% controlled by the French crown. Unlike the colonies in England, which started off with John Winthrop, the governor and stuff like that. So there's already this animosity between the French and the English. But when they start actually fighting each other in these little battles, the fighting style is very different. And that's what I had you watch on Friday, that one battle. The English have militia because they have small, they have these John Winthrop congregations that also form trained, armed soldiers to protect their lands that are also part of a knit society, and those form militia. But the English have also sent troops, and those troops are called regulars. But the French, who have French regulars, have guerrilla fighters. And they also have another creature that's fighting for them called the Coureurs de Bois, which are like French fur trapper survivalists. So I want you to just picture the guy and I know you all know maybe you are this guy, I don't know, who owns his own ghillie suit, who has like a whole arsenal in his garage, who has the survival gear. Say again?
They're pretty much the super soldier.
Right. Just imagine that guy who lives like the survivalist on his own. What are they called? Preppers, like doomsday preppers.
Doomsday preppers.
Yes. Imagine that guy armed to the teeth, but also able to just melt into the woods and live, with just a knife between his teeth. That's the Coureurs de Bois. The Frenchmen who were fur trappers, that's why they lived in the woods. But when it comes time for them to fight, that's how they fight. They fight from the woods. So they're every bit as terrifying as like the worst boogeyman you can imagine coming out at these English militia and attacking. They're called runners of the woods, Coureurs de Bois. and they're considered dishonorable. They're considered underhanded, and like they're cheating, totally cheating for like the whole war. But they do exist, and they teach English militia, American colonial militia, how to fight in the woods and fight to win and fight dirty and do what needs to be done instead of marching out like a great big wall of targets, which is how they're used to fighting. So this is the kind of fighting that's actually going on in Europe at the same time. This is happening all over Europe between the French and the English. But in America, it's a completely different story. In 1756, England gets a new prime minister, and that prime minister realizes that this war that's going on in Europe, that England can't win because the French are just actually really good at fighting on land in Europe. But he also notices that they're not really protecting their colonies that well. So he starts a sea battle against all of their ports and begins attacking all of the ports. And that's where the French and Indian War comes from. I'm going to put this slide up here, and it will be on Blackboard later. I probably won't test a lot on most of the French and Indian War, but I want you to be able to see how from 1754 to 1763, this war that's happening all over the world is really focused on the Ohio River Valley. The holdings in France up here in Canada and the holdings down here are fighting with each other. And everywhere you look, there's a river battle that's taking place. River battle, river battle, river battle. And everywhere that there's a river battle, the British are attacking under, orders from their crown or orders from the King of England. And they do start to actually win. One battle I want to tell you about, though, is the Battle of Quebec. And the reason I want to tell you about it is because it's an indication of how American colonial soldiers started to fight dirty. This is a battle that took place on the Plains of Abraham, which is above Quebec. Quebec is like, do I have a picture? Yeah, I guess I do. Quebec is up on a ridge that overlooks this river up here. Okay, the San Lawrence River. And behind it is plains, but you can't get to those plains because there's all these cliffs. So they're pretty sure that they're 100% secure. As long as they hold this little corner here, there's no way for English forces to take the Ohio River Valley. It's just not possible. Until James Wolfe takes 24 guys, 24, up a ridge all by himself and takes over one of the guns that's overlooking the river and allows in all of the ships that it takes so that they can dismount and they can actually have a fight, an equal fight on the Plains of Abraham up above the city. 24 guys climbed up the ridge and took out the guns that stopped English ships from coming in and reinforcing their men. So this was fighting dirty. This was a guerrilla tactic, and the Battle of Quebec ends the French and Indian War. It doesn't end the 7 Years' War, but there's no more fighting in America between the French and English after that. So the 7 Years' War lasts a little bit longer. It ends in 1763 when they have a treaty that basically divides up the whole world between France, England, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, the Portuguese. They all just decide which areas they're going to do their trading in and which ones they're not. So the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, ends with the Treaty of Paris, which divides up all of these colonies, and this is how America ends up looking. 13 colonies that belong to Britain, plus this part around the Hudson's Bay, which belongs to Britain. France gets to keep Quebec, and right now, France has to surrender all of this pink area as part of this treaty. France gets to keep Louisiana. Now, France and Spain trade Louisiana back and forth with each other. We're going to cover that more in like 2 weeks when we talk about the history of Louisiana Purchase. And then all of this land is set aside as a place for remember, the French and the English allied with Native Americans, different tribes of Native Americans. After the war is over, they say, thanks for your help. We're going to give you this land and we're going to let you keep it. And we're not going to move any further into this land. And they believed them. So that's cool. So the end of this war causes the colonies to think of each other as, closer allies than they are with England. Like Virginia is closer to Maryland than it is to England now because they fought together against the French and the Huron. They view the French threat is gone. So the only thing that's standing in their way is the Native Americans, and the Native Americans they're pretty sure are not as strong as they are. So they begin to look west, like we're going to move into that area. And they also show a lot of resentment between the militia and the officers that came from Britain and tried to tell them how to fight, because it was the officers from Britain who said, stand and attention and point your guns at the trees and stand still while they shoot you. And the colonial troops lose a lot of respect for British officers who think that's the way to fight a war in America. And because the French lose their colonies to the British, the French resent the British. And when the Americans decide to fight the British, the French come in on their side. All of this happens in 1763, and it all basically destroys trade for England. Like I said, mercantilism will work, it's fine. Salutary neglect will work as long as there's not a great, big, huge, expensive thing that suddenly England needs to pay for it. It needs every dime coming in and no expenses going out. Now there's been a war, and people are really quite upset about what they've lost and what they now have to pay for. So this new treaty causes the colonists not to be able to move west, even though the French are now out of their way. And by the way, some of that land had already been promised to colonists, and it's been given back to the natives. So in order to pay for the cost of the war, we have several attempts to soak more money out of the colonies. The Sugar Act of 1764 placed a tax on all the sugar from the French West Indies. And remember, one of the big exports of the colonies is rum and molasses. They make a lot of rum and molasses. You need sugar for that. They don't grow their own sugar. There's no place in the 13 colonies where sugar is grown, so they have to import it. British have sugar plantations, but they're not very good and they're not very plentiful. So rather than let the industry fold, the Americans want to buy sugar from the French plantations, and they can't, because if they do, then they have to pay a really, really heavy import tax. There are protests, incredibly violent and angry protests in the colonies because of the sugar tax. And so it's repealed almost immediately. It's passed in 1764 and it's repealed in 1764. But just to be on the safe side, the Crown sends troops into the British colonial cities. Now, what happens when a government sends troops into your city? What does that say about your city? If the government has to send troops into your city, how does the government feel about your city based on the fact that they're sending troops?
You a
You
bad
should be
city.
under martial law.
Okay, you're a bad city. You should be under martial law. Does it say citizen? We are citizens of the same country? Does it draw lines of us versus them?
No, they basically don't trust them because they don't think they're doing it the way they want them to.
Right. So you have this atmosphere in which the British government needs money. It's going to tax the colonies to get that money. And when the colonists don't want to pay that tax, they're sending troops in to guard them. Even though they repealed the tax, now they're sending in soldiers to guard the colonists. This is bad. This is always bad when this happens. Did I just stop my share again? I gotta stop doing that. Okay, so that's the first one. In order to put those troops into houses, they pass what's called the Quartering Act. They bring in 1,500 troops during peacetime. There's no war going on. The French are not fighting anymore. There's no point for these troops to be there. But New York City has to bear the brunt of housing these troops. And New York City says, we don't want the troops here. We don't need them. We're in peace. We are your people. You don't have to send troops into our city. We're definitely not going to pay to put them up in barracks. So Parliament in England closes the New York City legislature, makes it so they can't make rules anymore, make laws for themselves anymore. In 1765, in order to soak every possible dime out of the colonies, they passed what's called the Stamp Act, which is that everything that you trade and everything that you buy has to have the stamp on it. Now, you still have products that have stamps on them. If you ever buy a deck of cards, it has like an import stamp on it. So to prove that it went through the proper channels, this is a practice that still exists today, but you had to pay for the stamp with real money. So like with actual coinage. So if you were trying to sell a product, you had to also pay for the stamp to go on your product. And when you paid for that, that had to be paid with currency, with like silver, with actual coins. So if you started to run out of silver, you literally couldn't sell the product you had made because you didn't have enough money to sell it, which, as you can imagine, causes all kinds of problems in the colonies where they don't have their own silver. The silver mines and stuff are in South America. The colonies aren't rich in silver. They only have the silver that the British give them. So sing a song of sixpence. They only have what they have. So colonial protests come out against the Stamp Act. A group of people is formed called the Stamp Act Congress. It's led by Samuel Adams, who owns a brewery, and some others. Ben Franklin is involved, and they form what's called the Sons of Liberty, which is assisted by the Daughters of Liberty, which are like, I don't want to call them terrorists exactly, underground actionists. I don't know what you would call that. Professional protesters, people who basically plan and then implement events, protest style, in order to stop. They surround merchants that are using stamped items. They boycott items from Britain, and it gets to be too expensive to enforce it, so they repeal it in 1766. At that point, King George gets mad. King George was kind of always a little bit mad, but at this point he gets genuinely angry. The colonies belong to him, and he honestly believes that they should not be able to make laws that allow them to do things that are different from what he wants them to do. Colonists go and they testify to King George, and they seek counsel with him, and they have like an audience with him, and they say, look, you're making things difficult for life in the colonies, and it's not really fair to us. And his response to that is, my word is law in the colonies. And it's called the Declaratory Act. The crown is sovereign over the colonies. Parliament doesn't even have control over the colonies anymore. It's just the king. The king gets to make all decisions for the colonies, which went well, I'm sure you can imagine. In 1767 and 1768, they began to pass new laws based on the Declaratory Act, based on the idea that the colonial law enforcement bodies didn't have any power at all, not even in Parliament, that taxed all kinds of things. But the thing is, weirdly, the Revenue Act, which is probably the one you're most familiar with because it was the tax on tea, okay? The Revenue Act, actually, tea was less expensive under the Revenue Act than it was before the Revenue Act. The tax really wasn't that big of a burden. The issue was, it wasn't just that they were required to purchase tea and pay a tax. It was that tea had to come from the East India Trading Company. Do y'all remember us talking about the East India Trading Company? Like earlier in this Zoom session? What does the East India Trading Company do when it takes control of trade in an area? Anybody remember?
Tea?
When the East India Trading Company moved into India, how did it establish its control over the trade in that area?
By force.
Right. They marched in troops. They marched in soldiers. They took over trade, and once they took over, the local powers had no power to do any kind of trading outside of the East India Trading Company. So that's going to become a factor. A lot of the reasons why they protest this is not just because they're taxing tea, which people are like really, really addicted to, but also because they're stripping them away of their other rights. The Townshend Acts didn't just tax tea and glass and lead and paper and all kinds of other things that were really useful. It also made it so that local officers who belonged to the British could accuse you, seize your property, throw you in jail, and before you got a trial, you had to go all the way to England to stand trial. So basically, if you were accused of circumventing these laws, you lost all your rights. and smuggling actually increased because people are freaking addicted to tea. So you have a situation in Boston Harbor where British ships, the HMS Romney, is parked in Boston Harbor, and it's at Boston Harbor, excuse me, and it's enforcing the law in Boston Harbor. And one of the things that it's doing, it's searching the other ships, the merchant ships, and it's impressing the sailors. Impressment, that means that they're seizing them and forcing them to join them as, you know, naval soldiers, whether they want to or not. When the Liberty vessel, which was a merchant ship owned by Sam Adams, when it was seized, rioting broke out in Boston Harbor. Okay, and people were shot. I want to cover, or it wasn't Samuel Adams' ship, it was John Hancock's ship. And I want to cover that, but I want to cover that more on Friday. So I'll come back to that. In the middle of this tense environment, a thing happened. And I want to talk about that thing. Take a look at this picture. Okay. This is a print that was printed thanks to the printing network that was set up by Ben Franklin by Paul Revere in Boston. Just off the top of your head, what are some things you see happening in this picture? If you didn't know anything about this, what would you assume had happened here?
That the redcoats were attacking civilians at the time.
Are the civilians dangerous?
They're unarmed.
No.
No, based on this picture, it doesn't look like they're dangerous. It's more like, well, it truly lives up to the title. It's basically a massacre.
Here's a weird, interesting thing. What do you think about this down here?
Oh, the dog just watches on.
Anybody know why you put a dog in a painting? Especially when that painting is about something else. Do you know what the dog stands for?
No.
Well, which side is the dog on?
They're for freedom.
The underdogs.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what
It's
that
on
means?
the colonist side.
Right. A dog in a painting anytime between like the 1500s and even actually today, if there's a dog in a painting, it's supposed to be a symbol of goodness and loyalty. So which side is goodness and loyalty on?
The colonist.
Obviously. Now, this is just a brutal thing that happened. So let's talk about what actually happened this day in Boston. What actually happened was that Boston had an influx of British soldiers that were quartered there because the colonists kept having protests about things like this. There was a massive protest in Boston because of what had happened in Boston Harbor. And as a result, thousands of troops marched into Boston and just kind of left there to mill around. You guys like it when you walk into an area and there's just law enforcement just milling around. That makes you comfortable, right? You feel good about yourself and your situation when that happens? When there's just police just hanging around all over the place? Well, if they're quartered there and they live there and they buy and sell and eat and sleep there, then they have daily lives there too. So what happened here is that a tailor's apprentice came out and found some redcoats that were standing around, and one of them happened to owe his master money for a job that he had done and that he'd not been paid for. So this tailor's apprentice yelled at the guy, who was a junior officer, that he needed to come and pay his debts. Well, the junior officer had a couple of his buddies nearby, and they got into a shouting match with this tailor's apprentice. Pretty soon, the tailor's apprentice began to yell, and we're talking about a dispute over a bill, over an unpaid bill. But because the tailor's apprentice was surrounded by angry people in Boston who were resentful about the troops anyway, they began to yell at the troops. So the troops called more, the officer called in more redcoats to come and support him. And pretty soon you had an angry group of people yelling at an angry group of redcoats. And somebody threw a snowball, which probably had a rock in it. The common understanding of what happened here is that somebody threw a rock, but actually probably they were throwing snow. And one of the snowballs actually hit somebody in the face and caused him pain, and at some point a gun went off on the redcoat side. And as soon as the first gun went off, the remaining guns came out and began to And it became a firing between parties thing. Now, the Boston Massacre itself, only three people were killed instantly, including a former slave, Crispus Atticus, was killed instantly. Oh, I said it was a tailor, but it's a wig maker. Sorry about that. An officer struck a boy on the side of the head. A slave was fired up with the crowd. Officers warned the soldiers not to fire, and then they began to throw snowballs and then rocks and then other things. A private on the redcoat side opened fire on the crowd. So 3 people were killed, including the slave who had riled them all up. 2 people died of their injury, and several more people were injured. Afterwards, there was a trial. During that trial, only 2 were tried, and they were only convicted of manslaughter. And John Adams defended the captain of the Redcoats because he was a lawyer and he was good at his job and he wanted there to be a fair trial. So 4 arrested civilians were acquitted. So this picture that you see here is actually only the death of 3 people, and these people all should be holding rocks and throwing them at the Redcoats, and they're not. And this guy should be saying, put your guns away, because he was saying, put your guns away. But this is what spread through the colonies, the engravings like this and stories like this. This is what the British troops are doing to us. First they stop us from trading fairly, and now they're doing this to us. Is that something you can imagine happening today? Somebody
I don't
taking,
think there's any example of this ever happening in modern
it's
day
the only
culture
time in
or
history,
news.
right?
Only time in history.
Yes, where an event like this takes place and it gets out of control, and the witnesses only start to pay attention when there's a lot of noise and a lot of fire and a lot going on. And so this is what they see. But even if this wasn't what they saw, this is what was printed by one of the Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere. Okay, so what we have here is a tense situation. We have a group of people that just learned how to fight because they just fought in the French and Indian War. They just learned how to organize their own militias, and they bore the brunt in blood of that entire fight because Britain sent officers. But from 1754 to 1760, it was American colonial militia who were, being shot at from the trees. So we have a colonists who have just learned to pull themselves together to defend against the threat of the French. Colonists who are being united by printing networks that were put in place by Ben Franklin, committees of correspondence, they're called. Colonists that are banding together, and the British who are taking out all of their economic frustrations on them by taxing them higher so that they can make up the cost of a war that basically happened over in Europe. And then parking troops as though they are themselves an occupied foreign country instead of colonial people who belong to England, who are supposed to be English. In the middle of all of that, you also have this growing movement of, I don't want to call them terrorists, but that is actually kind of what ends up happening. A growing movement of troublemakers who want to upset the balance of what Britain is able to do. So that's the environment that we have at the end of this. Any questions so far about any of this? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and give you what it is that I'd like you to do for today. And I don't know if it's going to be fun for you or not. I think it'll be fun for me to read if you actually do it. Let me get into it. Okay, I got to go back to sharing my screen again. Okay. All right, so under your work for this week, what I'd like for you to do is to write a fake, I don't want you to post it anywhere because that would be crazy, but I want you to write a fake social media post about the Boston Massacre as though you were there, okay? The important thing to me is that you make it something that I would want to click on. So make the headline something shocking, something that makes you go, oh my gosh, you'll never believe, completely innocent people fired on, or something like that. Make it completely shocking, and then decide, look at the details a little bit. If you've got the textbook, the Boston Massacres in your textbook, otherwise you can look on Wikipedia, I don't mind. But you don't want to make it too long. 100 to 300 words is pushing it, but you don't want to make it too long because people too long didn't read. So you want it to be eye-catching, and you want it to get the point across. And the point that you want to get across is dangerous, horrible things are happening and somehow the British are responsible. Or you want to say colonists are responsible and you want to write it from the other side. Either way, you write it as though you were there and caught it on your smartphone or whatever, and are posting it as a social media post. Anybody have any questions about that? Does everybody understand the assignment? Where'd y'all go? Okay, I know what I did. Okay, so that's going to be your assignment for this. And then what we're going to talk about on Friday is going to be the pressure that they finally put on the colonies and makes them finally crack and decide that they need to take action. So you have a primary source document, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which we'll be talking about on Friday. We might have an assignment about it, but because we got everything kind of bumped back by the snow day on Monday, we might end up talking more about that on Monday. But go ahead and take a look at it. It won't make a whole lot of sense without some of the context, but go ahead and take a look at it so you're ready when it comes time to look at it. Read Common Sense and write your blog post, and that's due Sunday by midnight. Any questions?